Okay, it's live now. Good evening to all the members of Tiblane and attendees of the 10th Tibeto-Burman Weekly Talk Series today. We have with us our speaker, Dr. Krishna Boro. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics, Guwahati University. His areas of specialization and research interest are TB linguistics, descriptive linguistics, language documentation. He has completed his PhD from Oregon University, USA, and he has been teaching in the department, mainly functional syntax, linguistic field methods, projects in linguistics, and also PhD coursework. Dr. Krishna has also made significant publications. For example, he has published recently in 2016 in Journal of South Asian Languages and Linguistics, Volume 3, which is the Zai constructions, middle-like constructions in Boro, and in Himalayan linguistics in 2019, which is argument indexation in Hakun Tangsa. He also has published several book chapters, and also he has given several conference presentations, the most recent being 2018, which was Deictic Motion in Hakun Tangsa, presented in the 10th NAILS conference in Assam University. Apart from this, he has also received awards as a graduate teaching fellow during his stay in University of Oregon in periodic tenures. He has also been awarded he has also been funded by National Science Foundation during his PhD research in Oregon University. And he has also received Promising Scholar Award by the Graduate School, University of Oregon. He has also been very active in NAILS conferences and also in university services such as feedback collection, analysis, and report from time to time. He is also an executive committee member of Guwahati University Teachers Association from 2018 to 19, and he has been actively involved in administrative matters such as DQAC as a member from 2018 to 19, GUIUMS Departmental Coordinator 2018 to 19, Department Nodal Faculty from 2017 to 19. I'd like to request Dr. Krishna Boro to kindly deliver his talk for the present session. His title is Focus Analytics in Boro. Thank you.
Thank you, Monali, for the very elaborate introduction. And thank you for having me with you all for this talk today. And I'd like to thank everyone who have joined us today for this talk. So I'm going to share my screen first. So can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so my topic today is focus analytics in Boro. So what I want to do today is talk about a set of 5 analytics in Boro, which are listed here. What I will do is I will mainly talk about their functions one by one. Okay, so there are 5 of these analytics in Boro, which are very similar in terms of their distribution and also in terms of their function. And what I have called them is focus analytics following a framework by Eckhart Koenig. Okay. So I will be primarily using that framework to describe the functions of these enclitics. So as you can see, some of these have very familiar gloss. So for example, the first one, B, it can be glossed as sometimes also, sometimes even, sometimes too, or as well in English. Second one, law can be glossed as only or just. But there are some like ne, se, and tho, which don't really have a kind of lexical gloss available readily in English. So I would roughly describe at this point ne as something denoting or contributing a contrary to expectation sense. So as adding like it is X, not Y, a sense of correction. And the meaning of Tho can be roughly characterized as far as such and such item is concerned. Okay. So these are the enclitics today I want to talk about, and I will go over them one by one in the order I have listed here. And the data in my presentation comes from my own fieldwork and also from a corpus of text hosted at a website called CQP Web, which is a kind of corpus query kind of concordancing application hosted at Lancaster University. So, first of all, two very general observations about the enclitics. So what they are basically is that they are enclitics which are attached to phrasal units. Okay. So these units can be NPs, this can be a verb, this can be any kind of subordinate clause, which may function either as different kinds of arguments, like subjects and objects, or they may be adjuncts of various kinds, like adverbials. Okay. So they go right behind or at the end of these phrasal constituents. And in terms of contribution, their contribution depends on the host constituent. So it depends where they are attached to. Okay. So they usually have scope over the particular constituent to which they're attached to. So if we take these two examples, so in one, the enclitic B is attached to the subject NP, Musa, tiger. And in two, B, it is attached to the verb te, to die, right? So they can go on different kind of constituents. And in terms of contribution, as you can see, the meaning of B in one has to do with tiger, the tiger, right? So it is telling us something about the tiger. And in two, the enclitic B is telling us something about the event of dying, right? So their contribution then depends where they are in the utterance or in the sentence. Okay, so these are two very basic observations we can make regarding these enclitics at this point. Okay, now moving on to some terminology. Okay, so as I said earlier, so I am taking Koenig's framework to describe these particles. Koenig mainly worked on English and German in his work, and he identified different parameters for describing the focus analytics. And I find many of those parameters relevant in discussing the Boro data. So therefore I took that approach and I utilized those parameters in discussing this analytics. Okay. So in that approach, what these analytics are, which Koenig calls particles, and they are in some languages, but in case of Boro, these are rather analytics, since they are phonetically bound forms. These are focus-sensitive operators. So what that means is that their distribution, their interpretation depends on the focus structure of an utterance. Okay? So it depends where the focus is in a particular utterance. So their behavior depends on that. And that's the reason why these are called focus particles. Okay? And you may know that focus has many different definitions. So the one that's taken in this particular approach is that it's a device that establishes a relation between the focal information in an utterance with other pieces of information in the discourse. Okay? And these other pieces of information are called contextual alternatives. Okay? So the very existence of focusing in an utterance kind of indicates that there is a relation between the focal information and some other piece of information in the context. So, for example, if we take the first example again, so here the tiger, Messiah, would be the focused expression in that it carries the focus analytic, and the piece of information in that expression is called focus value or focus information. So the referent tiger would be the focus value here. And the analytic Boro here makes reference to other elements in the discourse. So in this particular example, the other referent is a human being who got scared. So that particular referent is the contextual alternative in this particular case. Yeah. So these are some of the terms I will be using very frequently, like focus value, contextual alternatives, or simply alternatives, to discuss the various meanings that the analytics express. Okay. So in terms of function, then the analytics, what they primarily do is first, they trigger a presupposition. And the presupposition is that there are other alternatives in the discourse context. And what the individual analytics do is that they specify a certain kinds of relations between the focus value and the alternatives. Okay? And some of these relations are like relation of inclusion, where the focus value and alternatives are both kind of the same kind or satisfy the same proposition. And there is a relation of exclusion, correction, concession, and so on. Okay? So we'll be talking about these various kinds of relations expressed by the focus analytics. Okay? So this is our first analytic, which I have termed as the additive analytic. So the additive Burr, the primary function of this analytic is to indicate a inclusive relation between the focus value and the contextual alternatives. And what that basically means is that both the contextual alternative and the focus value satisfy a certain proposition. So a certain proposition is true for both the focus value and the contextual alternatives. So we have the same example here again. So the tiger also really got scared. So what Boro is doing here is that it's triggering the presupposition that there is another entity who got scared. And in this particular context, that another entity is a person who was actually holding the tiger by its tail. Okay, so the alternative, that person and the focus value, the tiger, both satisfy the proposition that something or someone got scared. Okay. Similarly, in 2, the focus value is to die. Okay. So as says, two thieves become mad, and they recently died too. Okay. So here, the analytic Burr triggers the assumption that there is another event associated with dying. Okay, and that event is the alternative. And in this particular context, it is the event mentioned in 2a, namely becoming mad. Okay, so the Burr is making reference to the event of becoming mad. Okay, so both these events qualify the proposition, which namely that two thieves underwent a particular condition, and the conditions are becoming mad and then dying. Okay. So this is the inclusive relation expressed by the analytic Burr. And this, I believe, is the primary function of the analytic Burr. Now, there are other interpretations, actually several of them. And these are somewhat context specific. So depending on the context, these interpretations may arise. So one of them is scalar interpretation. So what that means is that there is a ranking between the alternatives which are triggered by the analytic and the focus value. So it's not just that there are alternatives, but that those alternatives have a particular ranking. So some of them are higher or lower in that rank. And usually that rank is conceived as a rank of likelihood. Okay, so in the literature, so one view is that the focus value is the least likely element for the open proposition. So, and the other alternatives are more likely. So if we take this example, if you put on lipstick, etc., nicely, even movie actresses couldn't equal you. So we have the analytic on the NP movie actresses. So what Burr is telling us, on the one hand, is that there are alternatives to this referent. So in this case, any other beautiful women. But at the same time, in this context, Burr is telling us also that this is the least likely referent or entity for this proposition. The fact that movie actresses couldn't equal. Okay, and this entails that there are other entities, and they are more likely in this particular proposition than the focus value, namely the movie actresses. Okay, so this one corresponds to, in English, the sense of even here. Okay, another interpretation is concessive interpretation. So this basically means that two propositions do not usually go together, so they are somewhat unusual when they are combined together. So if we take this example, even though he is a fool, so the additive is on the adverbial clause fool. And in this case, actually, "be" requires a temporal or conditional adverbial clause. So this concessive meaning is not found elsewhere or with other subordinate clause type. So it has to be either a temporal meaning or a conditional meaning. So Zamba blabber. So even if he is a fool, he is experienced in manners, thought, and work. So on the one hand, one proposition is he is a fool, and the second proposition is that he is experienced in manners, thought, and work. And these two propositions usually do not coincide, right? I mean, we do not expect somebody to be a fool and at the same time very experienced. So that's the relation being indicated by the additive and critic here. Another sense of the enclitic "be" is a collective interpretation. And what this one means is that a NP, which refers to multiple entities, takes this marker, and the set of entities is considered as a whole, meaning it's not a part but a whole group. Okay, so that's the sense that's added in this case. So in this example, we have a set consisting of two individuals, and what Bo is telling us that this is all we have in this particular set. So two is all, and we don't have any other individuals outside these two individuals. So in English, this will be translated as both of them. So this basically means that we have a set of two people established in the discourse, and we are making reference to the group. Okay, so this is another sense of the enclitic "be." And the final one that I want to talk is its use in universal quantifiers and indefinite pronouns. Okay, so these are a set of quantifiers and pronouns we have in Boro, and these require or take the additive. Okay? And this is very common across languages around here. So the roots in all of these words are bound morphemes. So for example, in boy, boy itself is not a word, it's a bound root. And to form a word, it needs the additive "be." So boy means all or everyone. And that is true for all of these different pronouns. So this is another use of the additive "be," and this one, as you can see, is very much grammaticalized. It's kind of integral part of these words. Okay. Now moving on to the second enclitic, exclusive law. This is kind of opposite of the inclusive in that it also triggers alternatives. So it tells us that there are relevant pieces of information in the discourse, but it tells us that those pieces of information do not qualify the proposition in the utterance. Okay? So it excludes the contextual alternatives. So in example 1, for example, only a few lucky people got to read books. So here law indicates that there are other people besides lucky people, right? And for the proposition, reading book, only the lucky people qualify, and other people, like those who are less lucky, they do not qualify this particular proposition. So this proposition is restricted to a particular set of referent. And that referent is the focus value in this example. Similarly, in 2, Angza bungdung bekolo kesola, keep in mind only what I said. So it's marked on the clause Angza bungdung bekolo, and other alternatives being evoked here are any other thing that the addressee may have in mind. And assertion here is specifically that those alternatives are to be excluded and only the focus value to be counted for the proposition in the utterance. Okay. Unlike the additive but I did not find many different interpretations or variations in the meaning of the exclusive law. So now moving on to the third, enclitic corrective no. So what this particular enclitic does is that it evokes the assumption that the focus value in an utterance, that focus value does not satisfy the open proposition. So that is the assumption. So we would assume that whatever the focus value is, usually that focus value is not true for that particular proposition. And what is asserted is that that particular focus value actually does satisfy the open proposition. Okay, so it evokes the assumption that it's not going, it usually does not satisfy, but in this particular case, in this particular utterance, the focus value does satisfy the open proposition. Okay? So if we take a look at this example, so it is saying that the lizard has forbidden me today from killing my wife. And enclitic is on the subject argument lizard. Okay, so the lizard has forbidden me today, and in this case, the lizard is the focus value. And the assumption that's being triggered here is that usually for a proposition like something forbidding me from killing my wife, that something is usually not a lizard, right? A human being, another human being may forbid me from killing my wife, but a lizard is usually not the case, right? So a lizard usually does not satisfy this proposition. And that is what No is telling us, that somehow this is not the right referent. But in this particular case, in this particular story, that is actually the case. So in this story, a lizard actually stops a person, the speaker, from killing his wife. So that's the contribution of No in this particular sentence. So on the one hand, it's making it clear or evoking the presupposition that we understand that lizards do not do this usually, but in this case, this is an exception, and it is actually the case that lizard did forbid the person from killing his wife. So that's the function of the corrective no. And like the additive, no also has a scalar interpretation in some contexts. So in this particular sentence, the focus value, gods, Modai Daudai Pura, is ranked with the alternatives. And the focus value is expressed or understood as the least likely option. Okay, so if we look at the example, it's saying that even the gods cannot fathom women's minds, right? So X cannot fathom women's minds. In this particular proposition, the element God is least likely. So it's evoking a kind of general assumption that we usually understand that gods know everything, right? So they are like all-knowing. So we wouldn't expect that God wouldn't know this particular case. But in this particular utterance, that is the case. So gods do not actually know or cannot fathom women's minds. And it's also then telling us that any other sentient being then automatically cannot fathom women. So the other alternative being evoked here is human beings, which is expressed in the subsequent clause. So human beings then automatically cannot fathom, women's minds. So human being and gods then are ranked in terms of which one is more unlikely in the proposition of the utterance. Okay. So moving on to the fourth analytic. So is also corrective, but this is not the same way of correction that we have seen for no. For sir, it evokes a alternative to the focus element. So whatever the focus element is, it's going to evoke some alternative to that. And what sir tells us is that those alternatives are not correct. They are outdated information, and it is the focus value which is the correct information. So it affirms the focus value as the valid, and it rejects the alternatives, contextual alternatives, as outdated information. So in this particular example, so it says Bharat should be the king of Ayodhya. So the analytic is on the subject Bharat, and it's telling us that there is another guy who is under consideration for this proposition. And that other guy is, of course, Ram, right? So the usual presupposition is that Ram should be the king because he is the eldest. But this particular utterance tells us, no, that's not correct. That's invalid information. That's outdated information. So the alternative Ram is rejected and the focus value Bharat is established as the right piece of information. So that's the function of sir. And sir is usually not scalar. So we have seen Boro being scalar, no being scalar, but sir is usually not scalar. It's scalar only on certain expressions, and those expressions are primarily temporal expressions. So only when we have temporal expression denoting time points, sir may have a scalar meaning. So that basically means that no and sir when they are on temporal expressions, going to evoke alternative points of time, and those alternative points of time are going to be ranked or ordered with reference to the focus temporal value. Okay, but there is a difference. They are not the same. The difference is actually they have opposite evaluations, meaning they select opposite temporal or time values. Okay, so for NER, what we see is that the time points which are under consideration are those which are actually later than the time point in the focus value, meaning those time points have to be in the future than the focus value. Okay, so if we take this example, so it's saying that Mithika, you go running without stopping right now. So there are other possibilities in this context, and the other possibilities are that Mithika could go later instead of going right now. Okay? So the later points are then in the future, right? So, but it does not select any temporal point which is earlier than now. So earlier than now are not relevant in this particular scenario, right? So I'm asking you to go right now, or you could go later, or instead of going later. Okay. Now, if we look at Sir, it's the opposite. For Sir, the time points are actually earlier than the focal time point. So the points are actually in the past instead of future. Okay. So if we look at this sentence, which actually has the same temporal expression, dase, now, but in this case, what it is saying is that now they want their relatives, right? And when did they not want their relatives? Well, in the past. So the relevant temporal points are past relative to now. And actually in this particular sentence, the temporal point is expressed here in the second line, which is before Sigang Lao. Okay? So the alternative to now was earlier, before, and which did not qualify, which was rejected, which was corrected, and the focus value now is expressed as the correct value. Okay, so both have the ranking between time points, but the time points selected are opposite. So for NER, the time points are in the future, alternative time points are in the future. For SIR, the alternative time points are in the past. Okay, so moving on to the last analytic talk. Its basic function is, actually it has two different functions. And I am not entirely sure if those two functions are actually homophonous of homophonous morphemes or functions of the same morpheme. It's kind of difficult to say. But at this point, I'm treating those two as the function of the same morpheme. So we find a contrastive topic function for thaw, especially when it is not on the verb. Okay, and we find the other function, which is corrective function, when it occurs on the verb. Okay? So as a contrastive topic marker, what thaw does is that it, like the focus function, it evokes alternatives to the value of the marked expression. But unlike focus, which primarily involves correcting, like in the case of se or ne, we have seen, they always involve correction. In case of tha, it evokes alternatives, but those alternatives are actually not excluded. Okay, so it does not involve correction, meaning it does not say that the focal value is the right one and everything else is wrong. It does not say that. What Tor instead does is that it tells us that the focal value is the clearest case for the open proposition. Or to look at it another point of view, the speaker is very, very confident that the focus value is the right value. And any other alternative that those which may be under consideration may be the right or maybe the wrong value for the open proposition. Okay, so if we take a look at this example, which is saying that the color of Boro women is not generally yellow, it is not generally white, it is not generally red as well, it is definitely not black. So the question in this particular series of utterances is that what is the color of Boro women, right? So the topic here is the color of the Boro women. And the speaker is saying, well, yellow is not the color. White is also not the color usually. You know, sometimes there may be some white Boro women, there may be some yellow Boro women. So author is not very confident in these particular cases. And similarly in C, the author is the speaker is saying, well, generally they are also not red, but sometimes they may be red. So in these cases, the speaker is not very confident. So these alternatives may qualify the proposition that Boro women are of color X. So they may qualify or they may not qualify. But the speaker is very, very clear that black is not the case. Okay, so black is then contrasted with all other possible colors, the alternatives. Okay, so that's the function of thought. So thought tells us that this particular value is the right value, and the speaker is very, very confident. And there may be other alternatives, but the speaker is not sure if they qualify or not qualify. So that's contrastive topic function of thought. And as I said earlier, as a contrastive topic marker, thought does not occur on a finite verb. So what it does is there is a kind of alternative construction for that. So in order to have scope over a verb, what we see is that first a verb is nominalized. So in 3, for example, labunaya, bringing. So the verb labu, bring, has been first nominalized, turned into a noun, and then to is added to that. So that way it has scope on the verb. And in this particular construction, then the same verb is repeated. So the verb labu is again repeated, labubai. Okay, and then the other proposition follows. So it says that as for bringing the woman, that is pretty certain, meaning the person has brought the woman, there is no doubt, we all know it, but we do have a doubt and the doubt is about whether the person will be able to take care of the woman or not. So the alternative proposition here is whether the person will be able to take care of the woman or not is the alternative proposition, and the speaker is expressing doubt about the alternative proposition. So the proposition in focus is the speaker is pretty certain, but about the alternative, the speaker is not that certain. Okay, so this construction is known as copy-verb construction, and it has this relation with focus or topical elements, particles. So there is a study by Pavel on this, so who looks at different languages and the relation between these topic and focus markers and its relation to copy-verb constructions. Okay. Now, the second function is corrective function. So we find this corrective function when the enclitic to is marked on the finite verb. As you can see in 5 and 6, it occurs at the very end, since it's a verb final language. So this is, the function here is of correction. Okay? So the sentence in 5 evokes an assumption. So it's saying that we need to do the small household work also in small amounts. And the presupposition being evoked here is that, well, small things are not that important, not that significant, so we may not do those, right? We rather consider more significant works worthy of doing. So that's the assumption being evoked here. And this particular assumption cancels that presupposition. So it says, well, even the small household works are also important and we need to do them. So that's the contribution of Tha in 5 and 6. And somehow that function is also gets associated with tag question. So in 7 and 8, we actually have a sense of tag question, not correction. Okay. So in this case, of course, we need also a rising intonation, without which this is not going to be a tag question. So both rising intonation and combination of Tha gives us a sense of tag question here. So in 7, a person is saying, you are saying this after thinking the matter carefully, aren't you, my daughter? So nung batraku sanane bungdung Tha. So Tha, so you will rise your pitch, and that way you're suggesting it's a question and it's a tag question. Okay, so this Tha then somehow gets associated with this tag question. And without the Tha, it is also not a tag question. So we cannot simply say Neng batraku sanane bungdung. So that will not be a question. So we need Tha. So that's another function of the enclitic Tha. So I am at the end of talk. So these are the enclitics and these are different kinds of functions. So to sum up, so we have these 5 enclitics in Boro, which are very similar to one another in terms of distribution, in that they can go on any phrasal constituent of a sentence, and they all interact with the focal or focus structure of the utterances, and how they differ primarily is in terms of the relation they express between the focus value and the alternatives evoked in each case. So for B, we have identified several functions. So it's primarily an additive, can have a scalar meaning, may have a concessive meaning, gets collective interpretation sometimes, and it's a part of universal indefinite pronouns. Law is primarily exclusive, no is a corrective, but may have a scalar meaning and have scalar meaning on temporal expressions as well. Um, and so is also a corrective, and it also may have a temporal scalar interpretation, but it does not have the usual scalar meaning. And third can be either contrastive topic or corrective, depending on where it is in an utterance, in a sentence. So it is a corrective if it is on the verb, and it is contrastive topic if it's elsewhere. And the corrective meaning sometimes may have a tag question meaning, especially with rising intonation. So this is all I have to say about this analytics in Boro. And actually, this is actually very fast topic. Usually one analytic is kind of, we have a lot, there's a lot we can talk about for each of them. And in my paper, I actually have taken all of them together because they are very similar to one another, and kind of it treated together gives a kind of coherent kind of treatment of the entire kind of area of this particular semantics, pragmatics. So that's why I've treated them all kind of together. But my presentation here is kind of very selective. So I didn't actually go through all the functions, or I didn't go through all the different kinds of distributions these actually have individually. So this is all for today, and thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna. It was a wonderful talk on the focus and critics in Boro. We have come to know of so many suffixes that have been so productively used in terms of pragmatics. I'm sure there will be questions coming forward from the members present here. You may unmute yourself and ask questions, and you can also drop your questions in the chat box. If there's any question.
Well, I don't really have a question. It is the first time the analytic term I come to know that this linguistics have so many grievous, terminologies, and it is so interesting topic. And I have, this is one of the say, terms that I have not considered in my studies to my language. Today, it opens my eye that there must be analytics in my language also, So it is a very much eye-opening topic for me, especially. Thank you so much, Krishna Boro sir. Thank you so much. And it is a very an eye-opening topic for me. And maybe someday I will be able to present this analytics of report. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Musil. If there's any suggestion also, you can put forward here. Yes, I think Temsu has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Krishna, for that very interesting talk. I just had a basic question. So I'm not very familiar with the syntactic and semantic aspects. But in basics in linguistics, we are given this concept of what an enclitic is, or what a clitic is, how different it is from an affix. So again, given the, I think, participants, we also have a lot of students who watch these talks. So yeah, I can see that there's a lot of the semantic as well as the syntactic aspect. But I just wanted to know if you can elaborate. So enclitics being something which can't stand on its own, and there's also a phonological aspect behind it. We calling it an clitic. So in Boro, what kind of evidence do you have to say that these are clitics? Just wanted some clarification.
Yes, Tensu. Thank you for the question. So a difference between affixes and clitics is that affixes are specific to lexical items. So if you have a case marker as an affix, for example, you would expect it on the noun, the head noun of an NP. If you have a tense aspect affixes, you would expect it on the main verb, for example. But clitics are not lexical formatives, so they are not attached to a lexical item. So these enclitics, they are not attached to a noun, or they are not attached to a verb, rather they are attached to a phrasal element. So the host can be an NP, the host can be a entire subordinate clause. So we saw adverbial clause, we saw nominalized clauses as being the host. So it does not have a specific lexical class to which it goes. So that is kind of the hallmark of clitics. They are not specific to a particular word class. And usually when you say suffixes or prefixes, they are actually specific to a particular word class. So we have suffixes of nouns, prefixes of nouns, suffixes of verbs, and so on. But clitics don't behave that way. So they are rather a phrasal formative, so they are attached to a phrase level constituent. And another aspect of them is phonology, of course. They have to be a bound form. So in this case, these are all bound formatives. And if these were free, then we wouldn't call them enclitics, we would call them particles. So that's what we have in English. So in English, words like also, even, to, those are called particles instead of enclitics, because those are considered as separate words.
Thank you, Dr. Temsu, for the question, which is very pertinent for the young scholars to know how affixes and clitics are different in TB languages.
Okay, can I come in?
Yes, yes, yes. Please.
Okay, Krishna, this is Hokip of Hokip. I'm
Yes.
from New Delhi. So your talk was really interesting, and it enlightens us to a great extent as to how Boro language in particular have so many of the enclitics that you talk about. So you have given two conditions. One is the focus marker, where usually attached with the nominal what you call construction, and also the alternative such as adverbials. Looking at your presentations, these what you call enclitics or focus marker can occur
with the nominals, it can also occur with other alternatives, so-called alternatives that you call. So if one of these enclitics is dropped, then how does it change the entire semantic interpretation of the construction? So these are ba and all these ba, lo, no. So are they obligatory to the extent that if one has to make one has to focus something, then surely ba has to occur. But when it is not in focus position, then is this optional? Whether my question makes some sense or not, that's what I wanted to ask.
It does. That's one of the aspects that people have considered about these enclitics, which is obligatoriness of these elements, whether they are actually obligatory elements or these are purely discourse level, elements. Now, the question can be looked at different levels. So if we just look at the level of grammaticality judgment as people make, whether a particular sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical, at that level, if you remove these enclitics, the sentence does not become a ungrammatical sentence. So clearly they do not operate at that level. But at the level of communication, discourse communication, I would say they are obligatory. Because if you remove these, then either the interpretation of the discourse will change or the discourse will sound very, very unnatural. So at that level, I would say they are required and they can be considered kind of a cohesive device for a discourse. So without this, the discourse actually breaks down, wouldn't actually express what is being intended. So at that level, I would consider them to be a kind of obligatory part.
Come to that answers my question. Definitely, in a natural communication, if one of these is left out, then the intended meaning will be adversely affected. And in that sense, you told me that they are, if at the discourse level, they are obligatory. Okay, that I agree. Why do we have to club all these what do you call critics under the name what is that the name I forgot under the name focus.
Focus,
Said, what is the title? So I lost your I lost the presentation. So yeah, you club it under analytics, right? So this usage of the term analytics. Are you trying to refer that since they occur at the end of the phrasal level, and more so since their distribution is not restricted to one particular grammatical domain, as you have already explained. So you have used the term enclitic. So is there any other terminologies which can go along with this?
Yes. People sometimes use a very neutral term, which is neutral to their exact status, lexical status. So people call them operators. So people call focus operators. That's a neutral term. And sometimes people use also focus particle as a neutral term, although that use is avoided because particle also have a very specific meaning, like enclitic. So one could use operator instead of enclitics.
Okay. Lastly, does or do these enclitics occur more prominently in the text because your examples come mainly from text? What about in spoken languages?
Oh, equally. There's no difference between these narratives and speech. They are all over the place. So you take any genre, you are certain to come across this.
Okay, thank you. That's that much. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Haukip, for your questions. And I hope it is very clear to the other participants also regarding the doubts that Krishna has clarified now. Are there any more questions from the participants? Please unmute yourself and you can ask questions. If there is no more question, then
Can I just
I think
ask
yeah,
one?
thanks for the question.
Yeah,
yes,
since I thought I'll give chance to others, but if there is no one, I just wanted. I actually have two questions. So yeah, all these interpretations, different interpretations that we have for each critic. Sometimes it kind of makes me think that whether our knowledge of English or even glossing of our text, whether that kind of drives us to interpret or come up with so many interpretations. But anyway, since I'm not a native speaker, I cannot contest that with regard to Boro. But I was just looking at two examples. The first was with regard to your collective interpretation, where you had this example of both of them. So in that particular sentence, I think that's a sentence which cannot be taken in isolation. It's kind of someone else did, and so both of them as well. So even both of them did kind of that. So if I take that these two contexts, if I take this example, not in isolation but in a context, then wouldn't it give us even the additive interpretation? So I can't quite remember the full example, but it was with both of them, where you
Yes,
had
yes.
the collective interpretation.
Yeah.
So wouldn't you also get an additive interpretation? It's like even both of them.
No, that interpretation is not there. So, and in this case, you are right. If you take this out of kind of context, so, or if you remove the additive verb from here, the sentence wouldn't mean what it is meaning at this point in the discourse. But in terms of having additive meaning, we don't have that sense. It doesn't mean that these are the two people here I'm talking about, and besides these two people, there are other people. So in this context, there are no other people in the discussion. It's only these two people who are actually relevant for this particular utterance. And what this particular instance is doing is that you need to take these two as a one whole unit. This is not a subset of another whole unit. So that's the interpretation Bo is giving us. And this interpretation is actually not very distant from the interpretation of additive. Because if we take these two individuals distributively, like one at a time, so this one and then this one, so in that sense, both of them, like recursively, they are additive in that sense. So I think that's one way these kind of meanings kind of vary depending on these contexts. And these are very slight variations, but at the same time, the meanings are not identical. So here we cannot and do not have another set of alternative besides these two individuals.
Yeah, so as a follow-up to that, even the other sentence where you have even gods cannot fathom women's, that sentence. So I mean, from the gloss, even gods or gods also, right? So there you had this the na in that sentence. So whether you can also have a, instead of na, whether a ba can come in that place. Is that possible in that particular sentence?
They are interchangeable, but there is a difference.
Okay.
The difference comes from their basic meaning. So the basic meaning of ba is purely additive.
Okay.
So it simply tells that besides this particular instance, there is another alternative. But for na, the underlying meaning is always corrective. So it is telling us that, oh, well, this is the value we have here, but this value is kind of the beyond the what we would usually assume. So God, for example, we wouldn't usually assume to qualify that sentence. So that's the kind of meaning difference between the two we have. But it's very subtle difference. I mean, both are scalar and both have the same kind of evaluation. The only difference is in the basic underlying meaning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Temsu, once again. Are there any more questions or any suggestions? Krishna, I just have one question. Are these the only focus analytics in Boro, or there are others also, and they have other contextual use which you have not given, or are these the only focus analytics present in Boro so far?
So far, yes, these are the ones that I have identified, and I think these are the all that we have. But I believe there is one more analytic, but that analytic is primarily topic, not focus. So I have excluded that one from this discussion, and I plan to look at that in future actually. So see how that one behaves, and if that one also behaves in similar ways to these or in different ways. Actually, you know, in the literature we make this distinction that there is things which are called topic, there are things which are called focus, and traditionally we do not like to kind of mix these two. But it may happen that in Boro, there may not be a distinction between topic and focus. All there is that these different relations that are relevant. And these relations can be expressed by this wide range of analytics. And sometimes they look like topic and sometimes they look like focus. That I believe is the case. So I still need to actually find that out for sure.
If there's no more question, then I'd like to request Dr. Pigeon to give vote of thanks.
Thank you, Monali. We would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Krishna Boro for accepting our invitation for delivering this talk. Yes, this was one of the interesting talk, and many of us have learned many things from your talk. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank our participants who were actively engaged during our discussion sessions, and other participants also for making this talk a wonderful and successful one. And I'm very fascinated to see the data so presented by the Dr. Krishna, and the role of the inclitics, which is being played in our languages, especially in Boro, in the discourse analysis. So thank you very much for this presentation, and I'm very appreciated to our Boro friends who have turned up for the first time in our Tiblane weekly talk series, and we look forward you to be in the upcoming talks also. Thank you very much for joining us also. So thank you everyone for joining in this 2 days weekly talk series of the Tiblane. With this note, I think we are almost at the end of our today's talk. Thank you once again to everyone.
Thank you, Bijan, for hosting.
Okay. Yeah, welcome. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And Monali too.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you to all. See you next week.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.